to the second keynote speaker of this year's Holocaust Symposium here at ASU. My name is Thomas Kaplan, and I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Holocaust and Peace Studies on this campus here. We're going to have the great pleasure and honor to welcome tonight the acting president of the Association for Jewish Studies, one of the largest academic organizations fostering the study of Judaism and Jewish culture in the world. And we'll have her introduced by, in fact, the head of the program here at ASU of Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies, Professor Kim Hall. Whom, of course, I would also like to properly introduce, because she also has very kindly not only decided for GWS to co-sponsor the symposium, thank you again, but also, secondly, in fact, has agreed to take on a teacher workshop on Thursday, specifically on the use of gender and gender analysis in the classroom. And of course the secondary school level. So we're very much looking forward to that as well. So Professor Hall, and keep it short in the interest of time, coming of course to the main event of the evening, is a professor of philosophy and the director, as already mentioned, of Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies program here at ASU. Earned her PhD at SUNY Binghamton. She's been in this campus since the late 1990s. Specializes in an array of important fields, from feminist theory to continental philosophy to disability studies, queer theory, and also critical race theory, among others. The author of a series of books, many articles and chapters. I want to only mention Whiteness, Feminist Philosophical Reflections, that came out in 1999. And also the co-edited Feminist Disability Studies that came out in 2012. So, Professor Hall, please join me on the floor to introduce our speaker.
Thanks so much. It's really my great honor to be able to introduce tonight's speaker. And I guess I have been here that long enough to know where most bodies are buried. Not all, most, but anyway. Okay. So, Dr. Pamela Nadell is the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women and Gender History at American University in Washington, D.C., where she also serves as chair of the History Department and director of the Jewish Studies program. Her areas of specialization are American Jewish history, women's history, the Holocaust, and Judaism. In addition to her scholarly articles and book chapters, she is the author or editor of 6 books. I'm only going to mention a few here. She co-edited with Kate Hallman a collection titled Making Women's Histories Beyond National Perspectives, which was published by New York University Press in 2013. She's also has a book, American Jewish Women's History, a Reader, published by New York University Press in 2003. Women and American Judaism, Historical Perspectives, published by Brandeis University Press in 2001, and Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985, published by Beacon Press in 1998, and this book was a finalist for National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies. In addition to her impressive scholarly work, Dr. Nadell is the past chair of the Academic Council of the American Jewish Historical Society. She has worked as a consultant for museums, including the Library of Congress and the National Museum of American Jewish History. And she is, as Thomas mentioned, the current president of the Association for Jewish Studies. Her awards include Scholar Teacher of the Year at American University and the American Jewish Historical Society's Lee Max Friedman Award for distinguished service to the profession. In their introduction to Making Women's Histories, Pam Nadell and Kate Hallman ask, quote, "If we embrace biography and the lives of the individual, often exceptional women, as a way to write internationally, what happens to the experiences of ordinary women, whose lives do not carry them across borders? If we employ masculinities as a way of rethinking political economy? Do we risk recentering men at the core of the historical narrative? End quote. Nadell and Holman stress the importance of critical reflection on the practice of women's history, as well as its role within nationalism and the discipline of history more generally. Regarding this symposium's focus on the Holocaust and women and gender in the Holocaust, their questions suggest the importance of both recovering the stories of women while simultaneously reflecting on the extent to which those stories challenge dominant historical narratives. The title of her talk tonight is Women in the Holocaust. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pamela Nadell.
I don't know that I'll need this one. I'm wearing a mic. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Everybody in the back? Yeah? Okay, great. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Professor Hall. That was just a lovely introduction. And a special thank you to Professor Pamela for inviting me to be with you this evening as part of this really extraordinary workshop on women in the Holocaust. I'm going to begin by saying that scholars were actually really reluctant to talk about women in the Holocaust, to take on this subject. And I want to take us back in time. I want to go back to 1979, which for some of you won't have been born yet, so it's really a long time ago, right? And there was a scholar named Joan Ringelheim, who was actually an oral historian, works on oral histories at the Holocaust Museum, and she found herself at a conference with a whole bunch of really prominent historians. And one of the people in the conference was a therapist. And the therapist said that she saw a lot of children of survivors who had been worried that their mothers had been raped. And the people at the conference said, oh, that's just ridiculous. We know that the Germans didn't do that. They didn't rape Jewish women because of the racial laws, and that this could never have happened. But Ringelheim was really upset because she had begun doing oral interviews with women and had discovered that, in fact, that women had been raped in camps, in hiding, in different places. And so she organized the very first conference on women in the Holocaust. And that was in 1983, so a few years later, when the Research Institute at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum opened, which is now called the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, they held an academic conference, which often happens when new museums open and new institutes open, and they didn't have a single paper on women in the Holocaust at that conference, even though people had suggested that they should. So why? Why was there this real push against women in the Holocaust? And on top of that, Ringelheim was charging that if you went to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, this is a photo of one of the sections of it, that women are everywhere in the museum. There's photographs, there's video testimony, they're present. But looking at gender as a category of analysis, understanding that women's experiences might have been unique is totally obliterated, essentially erased in that setting. So why? Why was there that pushback? Why was there this dismissal that we should talk about gender in the Holocaust? And in fact, just to contextualize it, one of Ringelheim's interviewees, this is not the person that she interviewed, but a photo of another woman, this woman also was willing to dismiss gender and her experiences of having been sexually molested. What she said was, is this important? It is only important to me at the moment. It is past, it is gone. So she was saying what happened to her, sexual exploitation, she couldn't focus on it given the enormity of the horror of the death and destruction and the violence of the Holocaust. But Ringelheim continued to push. And so what were the voices that she was pushing against? So she and others were pushing against voices like the prominent writer Cynthia Ozick. Maybe some of you have read the novel The Shawl. It's a fabulous book. Ozick wrote Ringelheim a letter and said the Holocaust happened to victims who were not seen as men, women, or children, but as Jews. And that was the kind of reaction that the first historians were raising. They talked about, if we think about the sexual experiences of women, rape, prostitution, sexual exploitation, pregnancy, those are always potentially part of any woman's life. How do you locate that as a factor in studying the Holocaust? Women who wanted to incorporate gender were told that they were imposing a kind of American feminist agenda on the study of the Holocaust, and that was just wrong. That they were trying to, people actually accused them of trying to take over the Holocaust. But what Ringelheim and others were charging was that we should employ gender as a lens for understanding what happened in the Holocaust, because rather than distracting us from the Nazi brutality of all Jews, it brings us closer to the specificity of the human experiences of some. So there was a legitimate reason, and it was wonderful that we talked about what I wrote about in that introduction about the individual stories, because if we pull this, if we erase it, then not only are we making male normative, but we're losing what happened to a segment of the population. So I understand the criticism, and I wanted, especially the notion that you're spending a whole week talking about women in the Holocaust shows that those who wanted to bring this into the discussion, that they actually succeeded in doing so. But you could see how this seminar couldn't have happened back in the 1980s, back in the 1990s. What the scholars who work on the subject of gender in the Holocaust talk about is it doesn't negate the reality of annihilation for the preponderant majority of the victims. But what they contend is that the road to annihilation was marked by gender. And that's my position, that's where I want to start. Not only am I starting there, and the historians who preceded me, but so did, here's a quote, it's actually Ringelheim's quote. So if in the gas chambers or before the firing squads, all Jews seemed alike to the Nazis, the path to this end was not always the same for women and men. The end, namely annihilation or death, does not describe or explain the process. And the Jews who were victims, at the time that they were victims, knew that. You saw in the exhibit outside, you saw something about Emanuel Ringelblum and the Oneg Shabbos Project, in Hebrew, the Oneg Shabbat Project. Ringelblum was a scholar in the Warsaw Ghetto who decided that he needed to document what was happening to the Jews. And so he actually wrote, he hid his documentation, by the way, in these cans, and not all of them were found, or only some of them were found. He wrote, during the time of the Warsaw Ghetto, the future historian would have to dedicate a proper page to the Jewish woman during this war. She will capture an important part in this Jewish history for her courage and her ability to survive. Because of her, many families were able to get over the terrors of those days. And we'll see in my remarks a little bit later how Ringelblum actually specifically went out to understand women's experiences as distinct from men's experiences. So historians posit that there are sort of 4 ways in which gender plays out in the road to annihilation. And your exhibit, I noticed outside, actually lists these 4 ways as well. So let me just repeat them for you in case you didn't focus in on them, but you could get it off of the exhibit as well. So first of all, there are gender roles from before the road to the Holocaust. So that men and women were locked into particular gender roles from the circumstances that they lived in wherever they were living. So think of it this way, the historian Nakama Tech talks about, so women were defined by womanly roles were seen as emotional, as protective, as able to adapt. Men defined by that kind of litany of masculine roles were seen as more heroic, more active, more rationalist, and could present armed resistance. So like when babies are born and you got the pink and the blue, right? So exactly the same kind of thing. That there were roles that women were plugged into before that would decide how they would respond. Roles that men were plugged into before that would decide how they would respond. There's another factor that complicates how people responded, and that is, I would say, a Western civilization assumption that the Nazis would do certain things to men, but they would never treat women and children that way. And this had very dire consequences for women. So men knew, they learned very quickly that men had to, because they were marked out as Jews, that they needed to escape, but women and children didn't necessarily do so. I'll give you one concrete example. So the Black Thursday roundup in Paris of July 16th, 1942, when the Nazis rounded up the Parisian Jews, took them out to Ville de Dive, and then eventually deported them to concentration camps and then to Auschwitz. Jews had been warned that that was going to happen. We know, by the way, in the Rome Roundup also, Jews were warned that it was going to happen. So men went into hiding, but women and children didn't. So in the Black Thursday Roundup, there were 5,800 Jewish women who were captured, 4,000 children, and only 3,000 men. And so this anticipation about how the Nazis would treat men, but how they wouldn't treat women, kind of Western assumption, affected gender relations. Looking at gender in the Holocaust, we have to talk about things like differences in the degree of harassment, in work requirements, in the regulations Nazis imposed upon Jewish men and women. Even though they were all destined to die, their experiences were different because of the kinds of regulations that were established. And then we need to look at the different reactions of Jewish men and women as they coped in different locations, in the ghettos, in the forests, and in camps. So what I want to do this evening is I want to build on this. And I want to take us through 3 different kinds of experiences in the Holocaust. And I actually want to start before the Holocaust unfolds with the rise of Nazi Germany. And I want to focus on the work of this scholar, Marian Kaplan, teaches at New York University, and this book of hers, Between Dignity and Despair. Kaplan is a remarkable historian. She understands that men, women, and children experienced what happened in Germany from 1933 to 1939 differently. And she also knows that, again, we're back to the stories of the individuals, because, and then collectively how gender affected them. So to give you one example, you teach, I mean, there are a lot of teachers in this room, you probably teach about, okay, so Hitler comes to power in 1933, and then there's the boycott day, and then there's the Nuremberg laws, and then there's Kristallnacht. You kind of like have that litany of the stages, right? But most people didn't live through the litany of those stages. They were living in 1933 in their homes, and then they were living in 1934 in those homes, and then they were trying to figure out, they were trying to negotiate what was going on. Kaplan is interested in how they were treated by their fellow Germans, 1 million of whom she believes were related to them because of the high rate of intermarriage. So she gives this really touching example of a Jewish woman who was a teacher, and she got kicked out of her position as the Nazis were essentially kicking the Jews out of the civil service. But the parents of her pupils gave her flowers as she was leaving. So she got this mixed message, this conflicting message about, okay, so she's losing her job, but here are the parents of her students who care about her. So what Kaplan talks about is that how did the Jews essentially become socially dead? She calls it, the term is social death. How did that happen inside Germany? And did gender matter? And she concludes, yes, gender mattered. So the first thing that happens is men lose their jobs, their positions, their businesses first. And their world, because they were much more out in the public, we're talking about a middle-class bourgeois Jewish community, men's world becomes constricted and they retreat to the home. In the home, women's burdens were increased because now they have to care not only for their children and their husbands who now don't have a job to go to, but they have to do the cooking, the cleaning, the shopping, and I would also talk about the psychological work of maintaining the family, and they have to do that in increasingly difficult circumstances. The hours women could shop become restricted. The men don't want to go out to the streets because they're marked off. It's dangerous for them to be out. So the women, we'll see this in the ghettos too, the women are the ones who wait in the lines. But these were formerly bourgeois women. They're dealing with becoming increasingly impoverished. They're dealing with their children getting kicked out of schools and the aspirations they have for them declining and essentially disappearing. So their world is also in tremendous transition. And there's a very interesting phenomenon in the way in which the Nazis were depicting Jewish men and Jewish women. So you've probably seen all sorts of propaganda posters that the Nazis produced about Jewish men and he is to blame for the war. This is from the movie about the Wandering Jew, so these negative depictions. Well, years ago I had a student who was really interested in knowing how did the Nazis depict women in their propaganda. And they didn't depict Jewish women in their propaganda. She actually found, this is Lindsay Harris, I forget what her name is now, but at the Holocaust Museum, she actually found that the Nazis didn't, maybe because of their focus on motherhood and the kitchen, maybe for that reason, but they weren't depicting Jewish women. So Jewish men go out in the street, and this is what they confront. Jewish women, they're out in the street, but they don't confront negative images of themselves like this. One of the places where we see gender really as a significant factor in the 1930s is after Kristallnacht. So the night of broken glass, the night of November 9th, 10th, 1938, when the Nazis staged a notorious and massive pogrom in Germany. And they arrested in that pogrom 30,000 men and sent them, not women, they didn't arrest any women, but they sent the men to the concentration camps of Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen and Dachau. We know a lot about this from various sources, but one that I want to introduce you to is Charlotte Salomon's Life or Theater. Is anybody familiar with Salomon? Let's see a couple of nods, not a lot. So Charlotte Salomon was an artist, and she essentially painted more than 1,000 drawings, paintings, of what was an opera. So it was meant to be an opera. It's got words, it had music, and it was called Life or Theater. And in this collection, which actually strongly, you can find all of it online now, She's with her, her father was arrested. He was sent to, I think it was Buchenwald, I don't remember which one. Her father was arrested, and she's with her stepmother here, and her stepmother is telling her, you must go to the police headquarters and ask if you can take your father some warm things. In the next image, or a few images later, this is a portrait that she drew of the women outside the police headquarters who are demanding to know where our men are. How should we know where your men are? The soldiers answer, go home or you'll get yourself arrested, you little Jew swine. And Charlotta doesn't have much success at police headquarters, which is full of sad women. So we see women interceding for their men in 1938 in Germany. And in the case of Charlotta's father and Polinka, her stepmother's efforts, it actually worked because here she drew her father coming home, or her father being liberated and succeeding in getting Albert released from the camp. You may go, you're now discharged. Of course, we know that many women were not successful in getting their husbands out, and many died there. So the Nazis, before the war, were treating Jewish men and Jewish women differently. We also know that emigration from Germany also reflected gender. So men it was easier for them to emigrate because they often had business connections, so they were able to maybe transfer some of their money and get out. I assume that you know that Otto Frank, Anne Frank's father, that's how they got out of Germany, and they ended up, I'm sure you know that he tried to come to America, he wasn't able to, and that's how they ended up in Amsterdam, and he was able to use his business connections. Women didn't have that same kind of mobility that men had, and the result is that more women stayed behind in Germany, and more men left and then hoped eventually to bring their families over. So the death rate for German Jewish women ended up being much higher than the overall death rate for German Jewish men. More elderly Jewish women were murdered. Elderly German Jewish women were murdered. But it's also that families were reluctant to let their daughters leave, but not so much their sons. So one program for emigration, this is Youth Aliyah. Youth Aliyah was a program that was actually started before the Nazis' rise to power, and it was to bring the German Jewish youth to the Jewish community in Palestine in the 1930s. And if you look at the photo, yes, there are some women in the photo, but by and large, the Youth Aliyah brought over boys much more than they brought over girls, because boys could help to work the land, and boys could help to build the future state. So there were these kinds of traditional gendered stereotypes. Okay, you send your son off, he can go and he can be a courageous pioneer, but you keep your daughter close to you, keep your daughter back home. So that's Germany. And if we ignore gender, if we erase gender, we miss those narratives. Let me turn now to the ghettos, to what happened to the ghettos, and now to Poland. So here's the Warsaw Ghetto. And just to remind you of what we mentioned a few minutes ago, Ringelblum's archive was to let the world know what was going on. 2.5 years of Nazi occupation, 1 year of ghetto life, is how it was originally framed. And he commissioned a journalist named Cecilia Slepak to write a separate research project on Jewish women's experiences. So what the historians didn't want to recognize, Ringelblum had already recognized. And because he argued that understanding the condition of women was part of understanding the human condition. She interviewed 16 women, and she deliberately chose a cross-section of those in the ghetto. So the ghetto was socioeconomically stratified, so she chose upper-class women, middle-class women, and poor women. She chose professional women and women who didn't have professions. And she asked them questions about their lives, especially about the move to the ghetto, which all described as traumatic. Remember, the Nazis occupy Poland, but they don't create the ghetto right away. In Warsaw, they don't create it right away. She asked how they reacted to being stripped of their possessions, stripped of their rights. She wanted to know how they dealt with starvation, disease, and unemployment. Sleepak was living in the ghetto. When she's doing these interviews, she doesn't know the end that we all know. So she's trying to understand life, the reality of the lives of these individual women. And one of the first things that she observed was that women outnumbered men in the Warsaw Ghetto. Why? Because men, like this family, the Skorecki family, so in this photo, the people in the middle. The second from the left is Mark Skorecki and his wife, Ruth, who's standing next to him, and their daughter, their eldest daughter, Lila. I don't think the youngest daughter was born yet, or if she was, she's not in this photo. This comes from a book by Lawrence Powell called Troubled Memory, which is about the Skorecki family, and especially about their daughter, Anne Skorecki-Levy. So when the war broke out, Mark Skorecki and his wife Ruth and their daughters were living in Łódź, and Mark left because the Polish army was telling Polish men, it didn't matter that he was Jewish or not, it was telling Polish men, go further into the east, regroup, and then we will come back and we will fight against the Nazis. So Mark left. Ruth then has to raise her two daughters by herself, move them first into the Łódź ghetto, then into the Warsaw ghetto, and miraculously, Mark comes back after over a year of being away on the other side. This is, it's probably a book that's not on everybody's radar screen. This is an extraordinary book. The first half is, I think, one of the best depictions I've ever read of life in the Warsaw Ghetto. The second half is about when they come to America, because they are, Larry Powell, the historian who wrote this, and teaches at Tulane, he believes they may be the only family to have survived the Warsaw Ghetto intact. They leave the ghetto and they survive on the Aryan side. But here's where gender made a difference. Mark left, and Ruth stays behind with the kids. So why, Mark left, he left to fight. Other men in the ghetto are having this kind of experience. And here again, here's Ringelblum's voice. Men don't go out. She stands on the long line. The women are everywhere. Women also have a different experience in Poland because many of them had educations that prepared them, unwittingly essentially, to pass as Poles. So all you had to do was pull down a Jewish man's pants and you knew who was a Jew. But women were, especially if they were fair-haired and fair-skinned, they had learned Polish as they were integrated into Polish society. So they passed, and they could hide more easily on the Aryan side, and Sleepak's interviewees moved back and forth between the ghetto and the Aryan side until crossing over to the Aryan side became an automatic death sentence, and then they stopped doing that. So she finds, she only interviewed 16 women, but a number of them are clearly going back and forth. So what are they doing? They're going over to the other side for? They're going over to bring in food. Because nobody could survive in the ghetto without getting more than what were the average rations. At the lowest point in, I think, December of 41, December of 1941, the Nazis allotted 184 calories a person. Women also were working in the ghetto, and this is a transformation of their roles. So let me go back to the Skorecki's. So Mark and Ruth both end up working in a factory. Mark happens to have been an extraordinarily capable individual. He was very good with his hands. And so they both get jobs in a factory, but then what does Ruth have to do? She takes her two daughters, Anne and Lila, and they lock them in a vegetable bin in their apartment during the day, especially during the roundups. And Anne and Lila have blanked out that period of their lives. They don't remember what happened, but they have to go to the factory when the roundups are happening. That's their only safety. But they can't have their daughters discovered in the apartment. And so she locks these two daughters, and you can imagine what her life was like every day coming home and not knowing if the girls would still be there at the bottom of this vegetable bin. Women, on the other hand, were the ones who, because of their nurturing, their sustaining people, they were the ones who tried to care for others, more so at least than we seem to think than men. So one of the things that Ruth Skorecki did was, in her apartment building, the poorest of the poor lived in the basement. And she would take a pot and go from apartment to apartment and ask everybody in an apartment to take a spoon and put it into the pot. And then she would have a pot full of spoons of all different things, and that would go down to the basement. So women were involved in the organization of these, of helping those in the ghetto. Of course, the ultimate barbarity was the murder of the Jews, and that is something that all the historians who write about gender and write about the path might have been different, but the end was not. And so here we see a deportation to Treblinka, probably from the Warsaw Ghetto in August 1942. And Sleepak went on one of those deportations. She died. Ringelblum thought she was deported to Treblinka and she died there. There's another historian who claims that she was deported to Treblinka, a work camp, and that she died there. All we know is she disappeared. She probably died only a few weeks after the very last interview that she had conducted. So gender mattered in the ghettos, and it mattered in the concentration camps, the work camps, and the death camps. Women who were deported to camps, who were visibly pregnant, were automatically sent to their death. Women with young children were automatically sent to their death because the Nazis assumed that they couldn't murder the mother, murder the children, that it would be worse for the mothers. So they were automatically sent to their death. Women who were pregnant, but not visibly pregnant, sometimes managed to hide those pregnancies and actually gave birth inside these various camps. And then the babies, if they survived, were killed immediately, or in many cases they were stillborn, because to have the baby would endanger the mother and the child, and maybe other people around who would help deliver the child. A particularly evocative story about this experience of pregnancy and delivery in one of the camps comes from Liana Milou's Smoke Over Birkenau. Milou survived the Holocaust, an Italian writer. Again, probably a name that you're not so familiar with. And her work was translated by Lynn Sharon Schwartz, and so I recommend that one to you as well. In the camps, I think we get on slightly murkier ground around gender, because biology was destiny, yes, but there are many memoirs by women that emphasize familiar relationships. They formed surrogate families in the camps. They describe women who were their camp sisters, or they describe camp mothers. They describe shoring up one another when one got really low and said, "I'm going to go throw myself against the electrified fence," and then the other one reciprocating and shoring her up. I'm less comfortable emphasizing this. It's definitely emphasized in the memoir literature, maybe because of some of women's basic, predilections to emphasize relations. But you will also read about these relationships in male literature. Survival in Auschwitz. Primo Levi's story, he says that he wouldn't have survived if it weren't for his friend. So I don't want to emphasize that, but I do want to emphasize one thing that I am almost positive that women in the camps did that men did not do, and that was that they shared recipes. They talked with one another about the foods they cooked, the foods they remembered, the foods that they would cook when they got out again. And I doubt, and this is all over the memoir literature, Miriam's Kitchen is a good example of it, but I'm fairly certain that this was not something that you would find necessarily in male literature. They also talk about prostitution, forced prostitution, and rape in the camps. And again, men may have been raped, but we don't have literature discussing it. I'll give you just one example. Judith Isaacson was in Auschwitz for 3 weeks when her unit was being essentially demolished. They sent women off in 3 different directions. Those who could walk and looked like they could work were clearly going to a train. They were going to be transported somewhere else to become slave laborers. The feeble were hobbling towards a truck, and they were definitely intended to be executed. There was a small group, and she was chosen for this, of young, attractive women who were being put in another direction. And she knew when she was taken into the camp, she had been told that whatever happened, she had to avoid being taken out for prostitution. And so in her case, she dashed over to her mother, who was headed for slave labor, and miraculously she wasn't killed. And others describe the results of prostitution and of women being sent to the front to be worked as prostitutes. So sexuality and gender determined their outcome. In the resistance, and I was talking with somebody about this earlier, Naomi, and I don't remember where Naomi is, but we were talking about this earlier. You've got a whole exhibit out there about resistance, about women in the resistance. I would say that exhibit is wonderful, and it's very important because it gives you individual stories. But I sort of see that exhibit as taking women and sort of throwing them into the resistance pool and stirring it up. It doesn't interrogate gender as a category for understanding women's roles in the resistance. And so I think it's really important that we do that. I'll just mention 2 cases. I didn't see Kielbonsky in the exhibit, but I didn't look at every single panel. So Branka Kielbonsky was a young Jewish woman. She was in the Bialystok ghetto. And her story conveys the range of women's resistance activities and also the way in which they departed from traditional women's roles. So it raises the question of gender in a much more important fashion than just telling her story. So she shows us, first of all, she wasn't a leader. She was just a rank and file underground activist. So she worked in the vegetable garden. That's something that women might have done. She recruited new members. That's something men and women did. She organized cultural activities. Again, men and women doing together. She also helped to dig a bunker. But then, and here again gender was absolutely critical, she was one of a number of women that the Bialystok underground resistance sent over to the Aryan side to act as a liaison for them with the partisans in the forests and the ghetto, and because they couldn't send men, and so there were numbers of women who were out there doing that. Some of them perished in their roles. She managed to survive. They didn't know each other because it was too dangerous. So what happened? She goes out. The first thing she has to do is negotiate a brand new world. She has to get illegal documentation to get papers. She has to go to Gestapo headquarters to get papers. So, and she's not detected in this process, others have been. Then she's got to find a place to live, something that she hadn't done before. Her family was in the ghetto. So she ends up actually living with 3 German road workers. And then she begins her activities. She smuggles arms. When the Bialystok ghetto revolts, She hangs on the edge of the ghetto trying to help some to get away. Her lover doesn't succeed. He was the leader of it. He perishes. She's not sure exactly how. And then she guides some people who got out, and she guides them to the partisans in the forest. And so we see women in partisans in the forest. Some of them are engaged in traditional female roles, and others were not. Others, like Kielbansky, actually worked with partisan groups, and she was involved in blowing up a train that brought German reinforcements to the front. Celia Lubetkin, Zuckerman, and she is out there in the panel, but the panel describes what she did as a founder of the Jewish Fighting Organization in the Warsaw Ghetto, but I don't think it really conveys how dramatic a role this was. One historian calls her the incarnation of the myth of the woman general. One of the first women in history to carry out the function of an army leader, and she was. She was a leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. She and Itzhak Zuckerman, they both survived the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They then go live on the Aryan side. Then they actually participated in the Warsaw Uprising, which the Nazis crushed as the Soviets were outside the city. And then the war ends. They're involved in bringing Jews who've survived, illegally bringing them to the Jewish community in Palestine before the State of Israel was established. And then they emigrated, both of them emigrated to Palestine. They founded the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz there. And both of them testified, not just one of them, both of them testified at the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. And Eichmann was a major Nazi war criminal and the only person ever executed in the State of Israel. And they both wrote memoirs. And there's a wonderful analysis that I can tell you about separately of how their memoirs and their experiences differ dramatically because of male and female voice. So I want to close with some personal remarks, and I want to introduce you to one more voice. I think many of you share with me this sense that the study of the Holocaust is a personal commitment. For me, learning the names, discovering the stories of just some of the millions who perished, and some of the very few who survived, is for me very much a personal act of witnessing, a personal act of historical memory. Understanding the gender dimensions of the Holocaust, I would argue, is as important as any of the other questions you might study when you study the Holocaust. That we can't erase this. So when I teach a history of the Holocaust course at my university, I talk about why the majority of Jews in France and the majority of the Jews in Italy survived, and why the majority of the Jews in Poland and the majority of the Jews in Hungary perished. I want to understand what happened in the resistance. I want to teach about the film The Partisans of Vilna. I want to understand the rise of the Nazis and to understand the background of the different police forces. Those are all major, major topics, but so too is gender. So I want to introduce one more voice that I would guess you don't know, and it's a literary voice. Just within the past 2 weeks, we lost the quintessential literary voice of our era, Elie Wiesel. And he stands at the list of Holocaust writers. He stands at the head of a long list of really famous men. So sort of the litany goes Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, Paul Celan, Tadeusz Borowski, Abba Kovner, Aharon Appelfeld, Don Pagis, and Arnold Schlustig, who many years ago was my colleague at American University. But I would guess, and especially because of the way I saw some of you writing down names, I would guess that if I would ask you to name female writers about the Holocaust, other than Anne Frank, you're going to have much more trouble giving me names. And one of the names that I'm going to lay odds you don't know is that of Nellie Sachs. Anybody know the name Nellie Sachs? Nellie Sachs, okay, so I see like 3 hands in a room that's probably about 65 people. Nellie Sachs was born in Berlin, escaped in 1940 to Sweden, and there began to publish her poetry. Her first volume was called In the Dwellings of Death, came out in 1947. It was all about the Holocaust. In 1966, she shared the Nobel Prize for Literature with the Israeli writer Shmuel Yosef Agnon. And so I want to close with a poem of hers. Oh, this is only a selection of Oh, the Chimneys. Oh, the chimneys on the ingeniously devised habitations of death, when Israel's body drifted as smoke through the air, to be welcomed by a chimney-sweep star, turned black, or was it a ray of the sun? So to close, I'm just going to give you this, since I don't usually close lectures with bibliographies, but because there's so many teachers here, these are some of the sources that I used, some of the books that I find really influential, and some of the voices that I find so influential. But I can tell you this is an extraordinarily large subject, the subject of women in the Holocaust. And I thank you for your patience, and I'm happy to take questions.
A microphone for that purpose, and if you would please introduce yourself by name real quick before you ask your question or make a comment, praise, criticism, whatever, in the spirit, of course, of this
Knock them
event.
down so I can see you there.
So,
I'm Kaylee. I have a question. You tend to focus on women within the context of motherhood and marriage. However, not every woman who enters the situation is married or has a family. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that portion, because I feel like that is also, that's another whole half of the women that are involved.
Right, so it's an excellent question. I ended up focusing a lot on mothers and marriage, in part because those were the memoirs that were kind of jumping out at me. Frederica Clementi's book, Holocaust Mothers and Daughters, answers your question. She is interested in mothers and their unmarried daughters and the relationships that they sustained during and then after the Holocaust. And you're absolutely right. Although a lot of women that I talked about, not all of them were married. Yeah, so Sleepak was, Lubetkin wasn't during the Holocaust, and Libansky wasn't during the Holocaust also. But you're right, I didn't single it out, in part because I didn't want to spend too much time talking about the sexual exploitation. And many of the women who write about sexual exploitation were girls in hiding or unmarried women, and so that they were in, because of age and attractiveness, they were in much greater danger than the people. Yeah, it was a good question.
Okay. My name is Fedora Horowitz. I was born in Romania. My father was in the concentration camp, not in the death camps that started from Yash, but you are talking about you woman. And I just read a book by Ruth Glasberg Gold. It's called Ruth's Journey. She was in Transnistria, in Bersha, and I think that it would be interesting to read about the woman who had suffered in other camps besides Auschwitz and Birkenau, and very many of those people suffered not from the Nazis, but from the Romanian and from the Ukrainians. And there were about 30,000 children like Ruth, who was 11 years old, and she was taken with her parents from Germany. She lost both her two parents, mother, father, and brother. So I think it will be interesting to hear from everybody that, yes, we're the Germans, but look at the others. Thank you.
That is an extraordinarily important point, the culpability for the persecution of the Jews by the native populations. And again, because this was only a 45-minute lecture, I couldn't do everything, but you are absolutely right. To this day, I can see this image in my mind. There's a prominent Canadian scholar named John Paul Limca, and he's been writing about the persecutions of the Jews in Lviv. And he came to my class and showed this. He found footage of when the Germans first came in and how the people in Lviv, the neighbors in Lviv, how they were humiliating and attacking the Jews. And there's a footage of this poor, beautiful, young, maybe 18-year-old woman stripped naked and running in front of her neighbors. And the Nazis are not doing this. And this is something that we know about. And we know much more about it than we did before, thanks to, for example, Jan Gross's work on Poland. Very good point.
Hi, I don't have a question. I'm Neil Lenton. Lenton used to be Lebetkin originally. Zevia Lebetkin was my cousin.
Wow. And you knew her?
I met her once, yes. She came to Florida to visit for a bond rally. She was there talking for an Israeli bond rally, and my parents picked her up and spent the day with her and brought her over to our house, and it was quite an experience.
Wow. Were your parents born in Europe, or your parents?
My father was born in Europe, and he was much older than Zevia. He was her first cousin. When he left, she was a baby. So they met her for the first time as an adult, actually.
Right. So he left before the war.
He left right after World War I. And my brother, when he went to Israel, he met Zevia at the kibbutz. And she was busy tending her chickens, and he was told that he had to have an appointment to see her, and he explained that he was a relative, and they said, no, and he was there with a guide, and they went and they found her, and they stopped in and visited her.
Oh, wow, that's a great story. I think in that wonderful, very kind introduction, you heard that I work mostly on America's Jews. I mean, all my books are about America's Jews, or this transnational book on women, but I am always conscious in my writing of that, a story like yours. So part of the family comes to America when they can get into the United States before the gates close, and part of the family stays in Europe, and they have completely different trajectories, completely different histories, but they're still part of the same family. And so it's really important to understand that sense of Jewish connectedness. So Jews, in the United States have relatives in Israel, and they don't have so many relatives left in Europe because of what happened in Europe, but they had relatives who were left in Russia, and then a lot of them come out in the 1990s. So the Jewish people are an international people. I think they're recording, so that's why you're going to be on tape.
I'm not sure if this goes with this or not, but it's a question I get asked in the classroom sometimes, and I'm really curious about it myself. When you were talking about where the women were divided typically 3 camp lines of going to either a work camp, a death, to their death, or to a recreation camp, or to be used for prostitution.
Not always. This
Not always.
particular-
Some did.
In this particular case, right.
But the question is, when they were used for the prostitution or what have you, how did they justify that when there were clear laws, as far as Germany was concerned, of fraternizing with the Jewish women?
So, I actually don't have the answer, and it's not clear to me, by the way, that in this case of this particular, the book is called Seeds of Sarah. In the case of Seeds of Sarah, that the women who were clearly being marked out for prostitution, it's not clear what men they were going to. So they well could have been going to men who weren't German, who were seen as racially, lower, racially inferior. But other accounts describe, a beautiful woman being pulled out and then being taken over to the guards. In Himmler's orders to the beginnings of the killings in the Soviet Union, where it's the Holocaust by bullets, it's very clear that they talk very euphemistically. They don't talk about using women to deal with the men. The men are going through the psychological trauma of having to do these killings. His orders talk about cultural gatherings. His orders talk about it's okay to use alcohol, but they don't talk about sex as an appropriate outlet. So we really, without women's testimonies, we really don't have a sense of the degree of what happened. And even still, we only have memoirs of survivors. So we don't have the full picture. So I don't really have an answer for you. I can see why your students would ask it. But you're right. The racial law prohibited sexual relations. That said, the racial law, let me make sure I got this right. Yeah, so in Germany, there were lots of mixed marriages. German men married Jewish women. German women married Jewish men. German men who married Jewish women, that was seen as less problematic than German women who married Jewish men. And so that's probably some of a carryover of what you see happening.
Lori Ramona from Millbrook High School. You talked about the traditional roles that women had before and then how those roles changed. What happened post-World War II? Was there a different attitude in the way that in Jewish communities, Jewish culture, that they looked at women, or what they were capable of? I'm thinking of like compulsory military service for women and things like that.
Like in Israel. There's no single answer to what happened. My favorite example is the Skorekis, where Ruth Skorecki must have pulled on every single emotional, psychological, physical resource that she had. When they're living on the Aryan side, she's accosted, there were like kidnappers. There were people who would go out and they would accuse people who they thought might be Jewish and, and call them out on the street because they would get money. And somebody actually, accuses her of being a Jew, and she lights into him so fast and so sharply that he retreats. And, it was just like an instinctive reaction. After the war, she's actually pretty much a broken woman. She comes to the United States, has trouble adapting to the United States. She's raising 2 American immigrant daughters, and all of the things that she did before, the kind of work and everything. She moves to New Orleans. She's supposed to become like a New Orleans 1950s Jewish housewife. Doesn't work. So she's an example, but then Zvi Lubetkin is Zuckerman is a totally different example. She goes to Israel and builds a kibbutz. So I don't think that we have a single answer. Let's see, what's her name? Beth Cohen wrote a really good book called Case Closed, where she talks about Holocaust survivors in America and how they carry the traumas around with them. And William Helmreich wrote one also, which he called Against All Odds, but he writes his as a happy story, they all succeed. She understands that it's considerably more complicated. So I think like in all of history, there's no one single theme. And I don't think anybody's tried to kind of synthesize it yet either, to figure it out. So I wish I had a better answer.
Other questions or comments? Keep, of course, in mind that last night we explored the topic also with another prominent scholar, coming also from a distinct direction, which often differed quite a bit from the reading you were presented tonight. And of course, in part, we're doing this on purpose, because we don't want to, of course, push any one reading, any one of you. And since, again, this is university campus, everybody should come up with his or her, of course, critical evaluation of the subject matter at hand. Okay, so now, first.
Yeah, I'm glad I got to go after Michael.
So, my name is Gabriel, and I have a question. Have you heard the story of Angela Orosz? She's a Hungarian Jewish woman, and she was born in Auschwitz, and she still lives. And this year he came to Europe, because now she lives in Montreal, Canada. She came to Europe to testify in against the SS guard in the...
That case in Germany?
Yeah, his name was Oskar Gröning, and then she visited shortly Hungary. So her perspective on the Holocaust might be a very exceptional, because she was born in the camp and she survived. And she told in an interview that she knows that it's only her and another woman or man, I don't know who, survived the camp, and they were born in the camp.
Wow, that's extraordinary. Do you know when she was born in the camp?
1944. Now she's 71.
That's an extraordinary story.
And Josef Mengele was experimenting with her mother.
Oh,
And this is
so
a
that's why
this is a miracle, and she was born and survived. Maybe you could contact her, because she lives in Canada. I don't know.
That's important. I mean, I love to give these lectures because, as I said, we need to collect these stories. We need to know. It's an amazing story.
I just wanted to say quickly that I recently read a book about survivors called Secondhand Smoke. And oh, what a powerful book it was about women and the roles of women in the Holocaust.
Do you remember the author?
I don't remember, but I'll try to look it up on my phone right now.
Actually, I have to say, I'm very, very impressed. Nobody was on their phones. And my class was
Okay, other questions, comments? Yes, please.
My name is Audrey Krakowitz, and this is kind of a grim subject, but no one has addressed really, and I don't know, it seems I have a recollection of women having physical experimentation done to them, especially their genitalia and reproductive systems, but no one's really discussed that, here, and that's, very women and gender, and I just wondered if you had more information, because it just seems back there in my brain from somewhere, but I don't really have any
Well, it
current knowledge.
sounds like Boris' comment, because you said that her mother was being experimented on.
Right.
I don't know a whole lot about the experiments, in part because I find them too painful to read about, and maybe that the J. Richton's Nazi doctors would have more about that. I mean, when I think of the Nazis and medicine, I think first of all that the extraordinary exhibit that was at the Holocaust Memorial Museum on the Nazis and medicine. I know traveled to Berlin and probably elsewhere, and we know that twins were invented, but I don't know much more about that.
That exhibit is online.
The whole exhibit's online. Wow, I didn't know. Yeah.
I think if I may add and insert, what's also important in this overall context is, of course, the question of sterilization, which I briefly discussed on Saturday night. But of course, it also extends to Nazi sterilization policies that were brought about already enshrined in law already in July of 1933, so within weeks of, over the process of Nazi dictatorship building. We have more than 400,000 forcefully sterilized, most of them women. And of course, the question also was how to do this effectively, quote unquote, from a Nazi mindset. And so that's another component of it. And you had, of course, large scale, the German medical establishment jumping in without much hesitation, and also being part and parcel of this as well. And of course, again, Germany being the unique case, but it's a pan-European, also North American practice, as we've seen. Okay, other questions, comments, praise, criticism, and the like.
Okay, can I say something more? When you said that the men were taking,
When I said that the men were the ones that were taken first to the camps, right? Well, this is what happened to my father. After the big pogrom in Iași, which was the biggest pogrom in Romania, in September 29, 1941, we were hidden. But there were people who knew where we were hidden. And we were in a place in which 11 families lived behind the church. Nobody could know that there were 11 families of Jews living behind in that courtyard behind the church. But of course, other people knew. And when they came to pick up the men, everybody came to the courtyard. We had to lay down. We didn't know what was going to happen. I was 5 years old. Only the men, they asked to get up because we were laying down, and they took them, I cannot explain how they looked, with their hands up like this, and they were taken to the death. So you were right, they were looking for men first.
And also because often they were looking for the men for forced labor. So they took the men for forced labor, and then later, as the war drags on, then women are laborers as well.
Yeah, and I think I had something else in my mind, but right now I'm too emotional to remember. Thank you very much.
oh yeah,
I remember what I wanted to say. No, when we lived in Israel, we came to Israel in 1958, but that's another story. The communism that was almost as bad as the Germans were. I met a lady who was in one of the camps. I don't remember if it was Auschwitz or another camp, but she was sterilized. And years later, she committed suicide because she couldn't have any children.
So the phenomenon of Holocaust survivors committing suicide is something that people are aware of. The most famous example, of course, is Primo Levi, who, after a lifetime of creation, and plunges to his death in his apartment building in Turin. And people are so reluctant to accept that he committed suicide that they come up with all sorts of alternative explanations. But Holocaust survivors couldn't live with the guilt of having survived. So it was they had scarcely escaped death, and the memories of what they had to live with was just too powerful. It's like the Skorecki's daughters who cannot remember how they managed in that vegetable bin from when their parents left at 7 in the morning till they got home at 7 at night.
Okay, there's some time left for some more questions and comments. So, anybody else?
Hi, I'm Barbie Quadrano, Barbecue. I don't know if this quite fits the picture, but when I was in 14 years old, my parents went to Elmira College for some feature, something that was happening, and they met a young German woman, and they brought her home. They were always adopting people. She was a college student. Her name was Doris Ehrenfried. And she told the story of how when she was about 3 years old, her mother put her inside her fur coat, walked down the street, and dropped her at a corner where there was somebody to pick her up. Now, her parents were wealthy, they had a vineyard, They were repatriated after the war. We managed to find them. But the man who picked her up and took her home was a Nazi official. And she lived in the closet for 3 years during the war. The biggest thing she suffered was bad teeth because there was no dental care at all at that point. It was incredible that they found her parents after. Probably money had something to do with that as well. But I don't think I've heard the story of a Nazi official that would have done something like that, putting his own family at risk. So I thought that was worth sharing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I know the book, The German Officer's Wife, and he marries a British woman and hides her. But I think when it gets, and we didn't talk about rescue as a gendered phenomenon. I think when it gets to the subject of rescue, there are all sorts of extraordinarily miraculous and improbable stories. You have to remember that in Poland, the penalty for sheltering Jews was death for the entire family, but not in Germany. So Poland was the only country where helping Jews was death for the entire family, and you find, and some, I mean, you can see images where, you know, the mother and the father and their children were all hung from a tree because they were sheltering people, but not in Germany. And she was a young child, so.
So now we have the title of the book, Secondhand Smoke, a novel, Pamela Rosen.
Oh, okay.
Okay, other questions, other comments, criticism, praise.
Or you can tell me what Michael said that I disagree with.
Well, let me answer that question. Wrapping up to enough, well, we can of course go there as well. But I want to ask you a little bit about, I mean, obviously you're very eloquently and as far as I'm concerned, also very convincingly laid out the case for the importance of gender analysis, right? And looking and analyzing the Holocaust.
Thank you, that's what I'm trying to do.
On the one hand, of course, one can say, looking at the scholarship today and also like forthcoming dissertations and recently published books and the like, and there's lots of stuff being out also sexual violence committed by Wehrmacht soldiers, raping Jewish women and all kinds of stuff now that it's become an established and of course very important field, a subfield in exploring genocide and the Holocaust. Now on the other hand, and it's interesting that you mentioned Hinker from Canada, right? I had a conversation with him not too long ago in which he blatantly denied the importance of gender analysis and rejected it outright. And of course, if you look at some of the recent criticism from established important scholars in the field of Nazi history and the Holocaust too, with Brina Byrne being an example, some of our colleagues in Warsaw would be another example as well. We also in fact see various attempts to downplay, negate, push in different directions, and try to come up with novel interpretation of the importance of the family, right? As an alternative, at least in those readings of those scholars. So I wanted to see where you, especially, of course, given your great many hats in the overall field you're wearing, coming down on this overall trend and development.
Right. So first of all, that was very eloquent and so succinctly stated, because what you're seeing is you're seeing a debate. History is not about the past as much as it is about how we interpret it and debate about the past. And so we're in the midst of a major debate about the significance of gender, frankly, not just in terms of the Holocaust, but in terms of everything. So, we're not watching the speeches right now, but this is a reality that we live with, and it never, I'm just continually astounded by how much pushback all over the place, forget about Holocaust studies for a minute, but all over the place, questions about gender and egalitarianism and equity, how we don't live in a really equitable society. So it spills over to this very small, insignificant cohort of academics, because that's really what we are. And it spills over, and we continue to engage in the debate. And as long as, what I will say is what I wrote at the end of Women Who Will Be Rabbis. So I wrote this book about women's rabbinic ordination. Jewish history is a really big subject, and the Holocaust is actually a really little aspect of Jewish history. It's very significant, but in terms of 4,000 years of of Jewish history, it's just, you're missing so much. So I wrote a book called Women Who Would Be Rabbis. I showed how American Jews had debated about bringing women into their clergy and making them, the equivalent of ministers and priests, starting in the late 19th century, and how they resolved the issue in a couple of places in the 1970s and the 1980s. And I ended that book by asking, would the most traditional Jews in America, the ones who are Orthodox, would they ever ordain women rabbis? It wasn't my question, it came from Blue Greenberg, actually, famous Orthodox Jewish woman. And now, in 2016, there are Orthodox Jewish women who are using the title rabbi. And so I've watched this transformation and the change. So my point, the question's not going to go away. Once people say gender is an important topic to study within the Holocaust, and they keep producing the scholarship, even if people push back against it, they're going to keep producing the scholarship that some people are going to have to pay attention to.
This, I think, is a perfect place. So please, let's thank again our distinguished guest.